Good afternoon and welcome to our midday session of the Politics of the Personal strand, and this session is known as Banter and Besties, Is Friendship in Peril? My name is Piers, Benn. I lecture in philosophy at Heathrop College London and Fordham University London Centre. Nobody likes to be rejected. Nobody likes to have no friends. But are there arenas where friendships, or at least special friendships, should be discouraged? Prince George has apparently started school where pupils are discouraged from having best friends. I was going to say parents are discouraged from having best friends, but maybe that's true as well. Can the flourishing of a friendship between certain individuals be harmful to others who, to put it bluntly, are not chosen as friends? Now, Aristotle, for it is he, wrote of three kinds of friendships: friendships of pleasure, of utility, and of virtue. It's perhaps the clash between friendships of pleasure and those of utility that might interest us here. Pleasure friendships are formed spontaneously with people whose company we enjoy, and that often means we share views, prejudices, and humour with them. We banter with our pleasure friends. But at work and elsewhere, we must form friendships of utility, getting on with people for the sake of a shared enterprise. We may not always like our colleagues, but it helps to be cordial and get on with them. So when do pleasure friendships stand in the way of utility ones? Does the banter that goes with pleasure friendships have a bad effect on the utility ones? How concerned should we be about exclusion? Under the Equality Act, you can bring a claim of discrimination if you think you have been excluded by banter and in-jokes at work. So where is the line to be drawn? And what sort of thing are we talking about anyway? These and many other questions are ones we might look at. I've invited three distinguished and committed speakers. On my immediate right, Martin Daubney is an award-winning editor, former editor of Loaded magazine, I believe, which I believe was a lads' mag of the 1990s. Yes, journalist, broadcaster, and co-founder of the Men and Boys Coalition. Dr. Shirley Dent on my far right, that's spatially, not politically, is a communication specialist and PR lecturer, author of Radical Blake. And on my immediate left, Abbot Christopher Jamison was recently elected Abbot President, English Benedictine Congregation, author of Finding Sanctuary and Finding Happiness, and a well-known friend of the Battle of Ideas. So I'd just like to ask you each, just very briefly, what you think the most important questions are for you, what you'd like to talk about, just very briefly. So starting with Martin Daubney.
Hi guys, my name's Martin and I'm a wanker. Now I say that, not because it's true, but that's the intro I use to school talks I do to thousands of children across the UK about the perils of pornography. Using my dubious past as a lads mag editor, I made a TV show called Porn on the Brain, looking at how porn was affecting the sexual templates of the UK. And I go into schools and I use banter as a way into very difficult conversations with teenagers, often 13, 14, 15-year-olds who are very concerned about this. And I want to explore the use of banter as an essential part of interactivity, and in particular how men interact. Today I have a report out called the Harry's Masculinity Report, which was done by Dr. John Barry, who's in the audience from University College London. Where are you, John? Well done, mate. And in that we really explore the idea of male friendship and how important it is to men in 2017. The answer is it's incredibly important. And when you look at how men interact and the language they use, if you wrote it down on paper, you'd conclude that most men hate their friends. If you look at how we talk to each other, my dad is the rudest person. He uses the C word to me as a term of endearment. And maybe that's a working class thing. He's a coal miner. Banter kept those guys alive down the pit. They were the rudest, most obnoxious, most obstreperous, most antagonistic men you'll ever meet. But they put their lives in each other's hands, and they tested safety through banter. This was a trusted circle of brothers who used humour, abrasive, dark, caustic, working class, rough and tumble humour, as a way of bonding. And that person's life was in their hands. And I hear the same story when I talk to squaddies, firemen, ambulance drivers, the people with the most dangerous and thankless jobs. Men often transpose their real emotions onto banter, not just as a way of teasing, but as a way of deflecting and as a way of gaining trust. And when you gain trust, you can have more serious conversations. This is echoed in other work that Dr. John Barry, today's star, has done. A great study out this year looking at the importance of banter in the context of barbershops, particularly to young black men. Young black men are 17 times more likely to suffer mental health issues than white guys, yet they are the least likely to go through the door of a GP to seek help. But they're going into barbershops and spending a long time there. And time again, they say they go for the banter. They're taking the mickey out of each other. But then they can talk about, how's the kids? How's the wife? How are you getting on? How are you? Are you okay? Banter enabled that conversation. Talk to the guys at the Samaritans, Martin Seeger, another great friend of mine. He says the way we talk to men on suicide helplines is greatly benefited by the use of banter. Men who are suicidal often phone up and start joking to the Samaritans because that's what we do. We joke first, we get serious later. Now, of course, banter has now become redefined as the most toxic behavior, the most toxic language. Banter, bant with a Z, is now shorthand for the most brutal and horrific language that men use towards women. How did that happen? How do we allow banter to be hijacked and ripped away from us? I want to celebrate banter where it helps us and put forward today the case for healthy banter.
Well, Piers, thank you. So Shirley.
So as a follow-on from the wanker to my left, I'd like to pick up that story about banter and actually tell a story about banter in a minute, which is slightly different from that coal miner banter that we've just heard. I want to do two things here today. I want to stand up for that friction of friendship, for friendship, but particularly the friction of friendship. And I'm going to come on in a minute to what I mean by that. A little bit like those coal miners and that friction, that fizzle that you get in it. And in doing that, I want to stand against what I see as a seeping, pernicious interference in that friction of friendship that seals us off from that friction, that kind of rubbing against each other in a interesting engagement, but I think also seals us off from ourselves. So I'm just going to tell you this story, which I think illustrates the problem we're confronting today. It's a story of Matthew Halls and Reginald Mobley. Matthew Halls is a conductor. Richard Mobley is an African-American countertenor who actually, I think, earlier this month, appeared in Purcell's King Arthur at the Barbican. Matthew Halls was the artistic director of the Oregon Bark Festival. And Richard Mobley was there, and they were at reception, and they had a conversation. And Richard Mobley was talking about a London concert he'd been involved in. And he said it was decidedly antebellum, to which Matthew Halls then put on a Southern American accent. Richard Mobley was born and raised in Florida and said, "Would you like some grits with that?" I can't do the accent, so I'm not even going to attempt. It was overheard by a woman. And what happened was it was reported back to the authorities of the festival, and Matthew Halls was sacked as the artistic director because it was seen as being racist. This is Richard Mobley on that occurrence. He was appalled. He said, "Matthew is my friend. Matthew is my friend." And what he said was, "I am the victim." This is Richard Mobley speaking, the African-American tenor. He said, "I am the victim of a falsified story. My voice has been taken away in a discussion, a conversation about race, which in and of itself is racist." And you know what? Reginald Mobley has got a point. He's got a really serious point in that. So I'm going to leave it there because I think that's the issue that is confronting us in what happens with banter and what happens in a relationship between individuals. It should be about the engagement of individuals. Nobody knows better who your friends are and what your relationship with your friends are than you, not outsiders. So that's why I want to leave it.
Thank you, Shirley. Christopher Jamison.
Thank you. Well, the two previous speakers give the impression that friendship is under threat in some way, and they're there as crusaders defending friendship. I'd like to take a different angle, which is to see friendship in a wider context. Friendship carries nowadays a huge weight of expectation. And this is partly because other kinds of relationship that have traditionally been part of our lives have diminished dramatically. First of all, take neighbours. Neighbours, not just the name of a terrible Australian soap, it's also the reality of many people's lives growing up in the developed world and in the developing world. Until, say, 50 years ago, neighbours were part of our lives in a very real way. They might be good or bad neighbours, but neighbours were part of our relationship, and our friendships might be a small group within our neighbourhood. And the notion of neighbourhood has diminished dramatically. Similarly, too, there were fellowships. It's a pity that there isn't a masculine, a feminine sort of, or gender-neutral word for that, although I notice that women at Oxbridge are still very happy to be fellows of colleges. But the notion of fellowship is one that's diminished even more than neighbourliness. So people would belong to trade unions, they'd belong to churches, they'd belong to political parties. And those kinds of fellowship, again, were a context within which there might be closer friendships. But the main point I want to make is that now, if you diminish neighbourliness and fellowship, you put an extraordinary burden on friendship. And so we get this intense defending of friendship. And we then get social media giving us a new way of having friends through Facebook friends and so on, which seem to me to redefine what you mean by a friend. You know, if you've got 1,000 Facebook friends, in what sense is that friendship as traditionally understood? So I would want to say, I think we not only need to be defending friendship, which I think actually gets a pretty good shout these days. My concern is about those other kinds of friendly relations which we had with neighbours, which we had in our different fellowships. Because I believe that those ones that bring us into contact with people who precisely have different views, different outlooks, but share something like trade union membership, that enables us to have a much wider place to go when we are in distress. We don't just have to go to friends, we have a wider fellowship to go to. And secondly, it opens us up to those more intense friendships with people who may be different to us in some ways. So I just want to broaden out our discussion and look forward to the questioning around not only friendship in that limited sense, but those wider friendships, friendly relations of neighbourhoods and fellowships.
Thank you very much for our three speakers' open remarks. Raise a lot of questions. I want perhaps to think about two. One is the question of what friends are, what they should be. The other is the question of what we mean by banter, and whether we might really be talking about matters of etiquette or courtesy when we talk about the obnoxiousness or otherwise of banter. Maybe if we started with the first question, so following on what Christopher Jamison said. For example, are Facebook friends friends? Anyone?
Some
Always?
are.
Some are?
Some are. I mean,
Most?
some they are FBs,
Yeah.
Facebook friends. Some are, some aren't.
Some are enemies.
I've got some maybe enemies. I think it's a really interesting question. And I think the thing for me that defines it is friendships are difficult. It's not this, we've got this kind of Care Bear-ish, anodyne perspective on friendship these days. And it's the, you know, you can't exclude people. You've all got to hold hands and be nice. I mean, we've done it to ourselves almost. We've made it almost infantile. We're sucking the banter, the difficulty out of friendships. I think I could count on two hands my really, really good friends. They're all people that I've had moments with, shall we say. They've told me home truths. I've told them home truths. There is an honesty in friendship, and I think you know it, but I'm very interested in Father Jamison's point in that the parameters are shifting and moving, and I'm really interested in the wider idea of what friendship means for society. That's really interesting.
Thank you, Martin.
You know, it's a really interesting piece by David Beckham. That's an oxymoron in itself, right? He wrote a piece about how he said he'd only got 5 mates. And I thought about that, and I wrote about it for the Telegraph, and I thought, yeah, I'm probably the same. I've probably got 5 real friends. What I mean by that is people that I would die for. The people whose children I would take care of at the moment's notice. People I would give my last pound coin to. Genuine friendships. Think about it. I mean, how many do we really have, and how many do we really need? And my experience looking into this tends to be that men seem to have less sort of close friends, maybe because men find it harder to be more open with male friends than women do with their peer groups. I don't know. I'm not a woman, I can't say. But having fewer friends of greater importance, I think we shouldn't think of that as like being something like a loser. Beckham was widely mocked for making this revelation. But then when we start to think about it, it's like, yeah, how many do you need? And today's sort of superficial kind of, am I popular or not friends, I think in itself becomes an abrasive weight upon our shoulders. I'm not very popular. People say to me, how come you edit loaded? You've only got 800 Facebook friends. Well, because, you know, how many am I meant to have to be a success? Well, you've got to have 2,000 friends to be a success. Who says? It's bullshit. You know, it's like if you've got real friends and you're happy with them, who cares about how many you've got?
On the question of whether children, though, should be encouraged to have close friendships, allegedly Prince George has gone to a school where it's discouraged. It's hard to know the truth of this. You've been in education, you've been a teacher. What do you think of that, Christopher?
Well, I think that it depends a little bit how you frame it. If you're saying that you want people to get used to the idea of a broad spectrum of friendships, like those fellowships I'm talking about, with people who are different, then I think it's really important that a school encourages that sense of community and diversity within it. And the monastic tradition I belong to has always had a slight concern too about what was known charmingly as particular friendships. There was I'm sure there was a sexual concern in that, but also there was the concern that within a monastic community, if you got just a couple of people over here who had an exclusive relationship, it was very bad for the community. And so I think that concern about best friends in school, I think there's a valid concern. I'm not sure I'd use the term best friends, though. I think I'd say be careful that when you're with your friends, you don't exclude other people, because that's a gang. And I would say beware of gangs in school. I wouldn't talk so much about best friends. And I think it's the gang thing that excludes that is always a concern for teachers.
And it is, of course, exclusion that worries some people that I wanted to bring to the fore, whether in the workplace or in schools. But Shirley, you had some point to make.
Well, there's a couple of things. My mind's working already because it's such an interesting discussion. I think maybe we should think about, is there a difference between friendship and solidarity? And this, who would you die for? There are friends I die for, but actually maybe sometimes there's things bigger than you that links you to people that would be worth, maybe, let's not be extreme, dying for, but you make sacrifices for. So I think I'm really interested in this wider parameter as well. Yeah. In the best friend moment, actually, I'm not saying let's all form gangs in school and anything like that, but I do think it's part of negotiating your way through life. And this idea that you flatten out that human relationship and that everything is equal. There are some people you gravitate towards. I was not popular. I was a bit of an odd kid at school. You know, I was excluded. But actually, you negotiate and you gravitate towards the people where you do have that relationship with. And that's part of being human. I'm really, really concerned about this external management of friendship. I think that's really, really dangerous. You can't manage who people like.
But Martin, you defend banter and you actually said that it saves men's lives. Do you find anything to disagree with in that, or do you have another perspective on it?
Well, you know, I think we need to define really what the boundaries are, don't we? Yeah. I mean, and that's a big sort of elephant in the room. But we'll all go, oh, banter's great. And of course, you know, we know oftentimes it's not. When I announced I was taking part in a banter session yesterday, I immediately was mercilessly trolled on social media for you're sticking up for Harvey Weinstein. It's like, what? You know, you're sticking up for no.
Just to clarify that.
No, what I'm saying is you know, the very word carries so much gravity and so much baggage now. As I touched upon earlier, it's come to mean the very worst of behaviour, typically perpetrated by men, and typically perpetrated against women. You know, misogynistic banter, you know, dapper laughs, you know, all these kind of names that leap to mind, and that's somehow become, I think, the way that we've encompassed all of it. Now, I've got a simple rule of banter when I interact with strangers, and that is I never say or tweet or do or say anything to them that I wouldn't want them to say to my mum or my missus. Because if they said that to my wife or my mum, I'd probably want to thump them or something, because I'm a bit silly like that. And so that, and I think particularly don't punch downwards. And I you know, think maybe I'm old-fashioned and chivalrous in that sense. I don't think that men should be going around being rude to women on social media. You know, I think the death threats thing and the rape threats thing is severely, you know, moronically toxic to all men, in a way that I've sort of tried to sort of use my voice to just say that, it's not okay. Obviously, it's not okay. And I don't think you should be joking about things like that. But maybe I come from a different era. Libertarians in the room would no doubt disagree. They would say you should be able to say anything. If you don't like it, well, just get out of the kitchen. But for me, that erodes decency. And I still think we need decency in how we interact.
I think the worry people have, though, is that people feel they're being policed, whether they really are or not, that they can't say anything mildly sexual at the workplace or say anything that might be construed as being homophobic or something, because they feel that the thought police allegedly are going to be down on them, and they feel or the real police, they feel that conversation, ordinary spontaneous conversation, has been neutered, that we live in a very polite environment. And I notice as a university teacher that things are politer than they were 15 years ago. I mean, is there anything to that? Is it just my febrile imagination gone?
Well, I think people are trying to police not so much the best friendships, are they? What they're trying to police are those wider connections again, which Shirley was talking about. For me, the issues are mainly around those wider connections. I don't think your best friend's going to take you to the police for, some kind of thing. And the friendship that Shirley described, clearly it wasn't the friends who went to the authorities, it was something. So it's the kind of wider connections. And I think that what happened with something like Facebook friends, to me, seems to be, it's a kind of new personalised trade union. This is the wider fellowship now. And I think what's interesting, we need wider relations. We all say, well, we all need friends. Everybody knows that. But we seem to have forgotten we need wider relations. And because we've become less skillful at them, they're starting to be policed. And that's what happens when, if you like, a natural social skill is reduced. You end up with people policing it. And so we have lost that wider skill of friendship in neighbourliness and fellowship. And I think that's actually the crisis, because then what happens is you end up putting friendship into a crisis because it becomes the meaning of my life. A lot of research by sociologists to show that among many, and I see many in this age group here, and I'd be really interested to know what you think, that the young who don't have so many of those relations nowadays in our culture put all the emphasis on friendship, so that when friendship goes wrong, they're actually incredibly vulnerable because there is nowhere else to go other than friends anymore. Even parents may be alienated, or parents have somehow now become part of my friends, Parent friends is something that I find, certainly as a head teacher, I found it pretty tricky. Because the parent friend wanted to know everything their child was doing. And then I said, as a head teacher, it's very bad for you to know everything your child is doing.
Or vice versa, perhaps. Yeah. Shirley, yeah.
I think halfway through I've wanted to change what I want to stand up for. You've really triggered something in me, Father. I want to stand up for the risk of friendship. I think we've got to be able, in that wider moving outwards towards friendship and relationships in society, take a risk on it. People may say things you don't like. It may get tricky, but we've got to be able, as adults, without external state, etc., interference, be able to do that. I also just want to say, just to disabuse you for a moment, Martin, women do have banter too. We have quite strong banter, my close group of girlfriends, and I overhear young women speaking, older women speaking. We can give as good as we get on that, believe me. And I think we've got to be careful. Of course, it's distasteful and it's ugly for strangers, and I think that's the problem. Sometimes it's strangers saying to some women, I am going to rape you, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that online. I mean, it's horrible. But let's be careful to say, I do not need to be protected from that risk of that relationship. I need to be out there as a woman in the world, publicly negotiating that for myself. I've got to be able to do that, or I've got no place in the adult world. We've got to be able to stand on our own 2 feet and do that.
But Shirley, you mentioned strangers. I think we can all agree with that. What about colleagues or people you have to work with? I mean, the worry about office banter, for example, that might be construed as being sexist or racist or anti-gay and so on, is that people may really feel excluded. They may really feel that if they are, for example, gay or whatever it is, that they're being mocked, that there's a joke on them, that they're not being let into and so on.
You see, here's the thing. I like people. and I trust people. I think most people in this room think that as well. I don't think in my life, I'll give you one example actually, going back. Well, I've worked with anybody who was openly, obnoxiously racist or sexist or homophobic. And what I see in offices now is that it's almost everybody's a little bit on eggshells. It takes a long time to know, have I said the wrong thing? You're double-checking yourself. You're not relating to somebody just as they are, right? We're putting everybody into boxes rather than saying, how do we get along together? But I will tell you a story, because as a student, in those days when you didn't intern, you actually got jobs during the summer holiday, and there were jobs to get in that golden age. There were jobs. I worked in a factory in Manor House, and it was going to be closed down. It was a factory, bizarrely, it made the powder that went into hip implants, and I was on the packing desk. And there were people who had been there for a long, long time. And there was one guy in particular who worked on the line who said things which were, I was there going, college student going, oh my God, I can't believe you just said that, packing away, which were out and out racist. I mean, it was just old-fashioned 1970s style racism. I'm not that old. It was later than that I worked there. The thing was, there were women who had worked with this guy. There was a West Indian woman. There was an Indian woman who worked on the line. And one of the younger women went, Bill, you're just racist. And then Mary, the West Indian woman, just went, Bill's all right. Bill's all right. And it was a weird moment for me, because they'd obviously come through the factory for 20 years and had a relationship, even though this guy was saying outrageous things, and they got on. And it was, I still think about that. And it made me uncomfortable, because it's my delicate feelings as a, precious college student.
Well, that's the example of two people who got on, but you might ask, what about those who don't?
It's a good question.
Martin, do you have any points on any of that?
I just want to touch upon something which I hope that the audience are going to start firing questions about, and that is, the involvement of Banter and the law, the police in particular. I'm from Nottingham. Nottingham is unique now, and the Nottinghamshire Police Force has reclassified misogyny as a hate crime. There have been 30 incidents in the last year of misogyny as a specific hate crime, which obviously is very concerning. And so I decided to look into this. I got Freedom of Information Act. And what's going on? What is all this stuff? And, I'm serious when I say that some of those complaints were offensive jokes that people overheard in pubs. It's like, hang on a minute. We have laws that should robustly, pursue anybody who's horrific and violent, and demeaning towards, anybody. But what I'm worried about is inventing new crimes to sort of show that we're doing our bit for women, or any sort of groups. But really, are we just dodging the issue? Why aren't we, for example, to put another sort of cat among the pages, why have there been zero prosecutions for female genital mutilation, whereas we're now going after tweets and jokes? And is that really, the sort of society that we need to be living in? I don't know the answer. I'd be interested in your opinions on that. But when we're policing language and we're policing jokes, what's going on?
Christopher, do you police your jokes, or do we have to police them for you?
Well, this is all part of the sort of safe space agenda, isn't it? Which I know the Institute of Ideas is campaigning against safe spaces. And I think it comes back to the ability to cope with people who are very different. Your extraordinary example, which I do find extraordinary. Yeah. But I live in a monastic community with 20 other men who I did not choose. They all have different political views, for example. Monks do vote, by the way. People think somehow monks shouldn't vote. We have very different political views. We have different age ranges and so on. We're from sort of 25 to 85. So we have to learn the kind of connections you're talking about. I mean, not many of my brethren go around making racist jokes, but they're quite possibly have very different political views. We have to learn to live with that without artificial safe spaces. But I would say, I think that the Christian tradition of community, in that sense, of being church, is actually an example of a self-policed safe space. And I think it's that we need to create. not ones where you've got actual policemen policing it, but that the community itself learns through neighbourliness, and I would say that learns how to be good neighbours who allow that diversity, which we somehow auto-correct. And I think that's the skill that we're lacking, because clearly they had auto-corrected, if you like, their workplace. And I think that's, again, it might be a sort of trade union that could do that. These are the sorts of institutions that I think we desperately need to strengthen. But mention the word institution, of course, and everybody goes foaming at the mouth saying, oh, we don't want institutions, we don't want to be institutionalized. Well, no, I say, let's have friendship, but let's actually create institutions around that enable wider relations.
Very quickly, I think, again, Father, it comes back to the point you made, because that wouldn't happen nowadays, that situation. It wouldn't happen. Yeah. That's not because language has been policed, it's because society has changed. Yes, I remember growing up in a North London council.
Society self-policed itself.
Growing up in a North London council estate, as a child of an Irish parent, we got some stuff. There were also NF slogans on that estate. We have moved on. Society, the wider society, has changed. And that's also got something to do with our relationships with each other.
Well, I think it's now time for our discussion to be policed by the audience.
In the workplace, I think women's banter today is called gossip, and that carries on. And men generally find themselves excluded from that. Women don't hold back. But men, I think, over the last 20 years have become almost mute in the workplace in terms of banter for fear of causing offence to someone. And that's why men go to work these days and leave, go home, and the women are networking and that sort of thing in the evening over a glass of wine in ways they didn't do 20 years ago. The workplace has changed and become toxic, not necessarily for women, but increasingly, I think, for men.
Maybe I'm on my own here, but I think the celebration of banter is utterly banal and bad. I mean...
Sounds like you're in your own.
Bants...
Carry on.
Okay, Martin, what you were talking about in the past, where sort of male networks of association could be very rude with each other, that's absolutely true, but that wasn't celebrated in and of itself as a cultural thing to be marvelled at. You know, today we hold banter up as it symbolises the celebration of the banal. You know, when Boaty McBoatyface was elected as the name of a boat to undertake an expedition to the Arctic, everyone just hashtag it, oh, what bants, you know, brilliant bants. And really, what I'm worried about is this complete celebration of what was once a very banal aspect of male friendship, i.e. the rudeness of the language they happen to use. I mean, that was the most meaningless part of it. But I think, Martin, you end up making the same argument. You end up elevating it to the most important part of being a modern man, and sort of it's a route into being able to talk about your emotions, or, you know, preventing yourself from killing yourself. I mean, that seems to me to be a very empty and vacuous model of what modern male friendship could be about, or any form of friendship, whether it be male or female. Now, just to pick up on something Shirley said, I think the key important point that's been missed here is that friendship is an area in which the dynamics are best negotiated by the people involved. That's the key point. And it's like many other relationships in society that have been undermined and interfered with. All sorts of intimate relationships are being undermined and interfered with. Friendship is one of them. And I think we need to return to focusing on that being the value of friendship, that the form it takes is two people who know better than anyone else what the terms of that interaction should be. And I think if we can focus on the content of friendship as a relationship between people, rather than the relatively banal language that they happen to use, I think we would move away from celebrating banter, and maybe that would be a good thing.
Christopher, you said that the less skillful we are at dealing with personal relationships, the more they're policed. I'd suggest actually the cause and effect goes the other way. I think this is a top-down problem. In other words, we haven't suddenly grown up being unable to deal with our relationships. We've been told that we can't deal with our relationships. So the problem is primarily one of policing. And I think you can see that in the school playground, where whether or not, Piers, the example you give of Prince George not being allowed to have best friends, whether or not that's true, it wouldn't surprise me if it is true, because we know that the school playground is now heavily policed. Whereas when I was at school, so long as you didn't start beating kids up, the teachers left you alone. And there was a very good reason for that, which was that in the school playground, you learnt about life. You learnt how to negotiate your relationships with people. You learnt how to take knocks and to handle them. And that's a very important part about how organically society, if it is left alone, will develop. And the problem has been this top-down policing, which has been informed by notions which are determined to break bonds of solidarity and friendship in favour of individualism. And I think that's a very prevalent problem. The only thing I will agree with you, Christopher, is it does become a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you like. You get into a cycle whereby, because of this top-down policing, people then, of course, aren't able to handle their relationships, so that does give rise to a need for more policing. But to break the cycle, we have to get rid of this top-down policing. And you're quite right, Martin, the law has got a lot to do with this.
Okay, thank you very much. I will come back to the audience, but I want to give the panel a chance to comment on anything they've heard. Martin, your banter's banal. Right?
Yeah. Right. That's part of the point. Okay, 2 points. The gentleman here who talks about banter becoming sort of risky for men. I think there's more. It's also becoming injurious or kind of restrictive to women, and I'll explain why. A big piece came out in America about looking into sexism in the White House and who was hired as interns and how long interns were getting access to senators and to central government workers and therefore to further their careers. And an interesting thing came up, and that was that the men were saying that they were increasingly reluctant to hire young women for these roles because they were so scared of saying something inappropriate or kind of getting like an HR suit and all of this, that they were spending less time with the women interns. They were giving them less work, and they were just having their careers kind of restricted in a sense because of the fear of what might happen just through one kind of misplaced comment. So there's a sense of managing behind open doors was the phrase. So doors were never closed on officers in case something was misconstrued or a false allegation came forward. So I think that's an interesting point. Of course, my friend at the back, who wasn't on his own, you did get one person agreeing with you, about banter being banal. That is kind of the point. I obviously didn't celebrate it as the most important thing in men's emotional kind of toolbox, but it is a part of that. You know, if you, like I said, I've just completed the biggest academic survey into how British men are thinking in 2017, and we've found time and time again that banter did come up as a useful way of starting conversations, and this is echoed by the Male Psychology Network, who are here today, who just tell us that if we understand how men talk to each other, and rather than at the moment this whole dialogue is, men, go on, talk more, come on, get on with it. You're kidding yourselves, you're not talking enough. But that's because we don't understand how men talk, and we don't talk to them on their terms. Men don't routinely volunteer and open up information in the same way that women do. Maybe we should, maybe we're changing, maybe men are more progressive, but for right now, understanding how men interact and using banter is a healthy part of the war chest in having these difficult conversations. I disagree with you, sir.
Thank you very much. Well, there we are. That was a banterous comments. You've been disagreed with. Christopher, did you?
I'd like to tell you about a chapter of the Rule of St. Benedict. The Rule of St. Benedict was written 1,500 years ago to help Christian men who wanted to live as monks. And one of the chapters is entitled, Why Monks Should Not Hit Each Other. Now, this is relevant to the point that was made up here about, is this policing of relationships because we've been told we're no good at them, we then become less skillful. The Rule of St. Benedict tells us that no matter where you put men together, and women would be the same, I'm sure, they're going to actually have violent disagreements, both metaphorically violent and sometimes physically violent. And for me, the playground issue is really interesting because what I've tried to do, and I know what other head teachers have tried to do, is to actually teach people how to live in an unpoliced playground. But you can't leave it to the law of the jungle, which is what frankly happened in schools in the past. And so you had horrendous bullying. Now, it was only directed towards a few people, but it was unacceptable that because we had this open area where people were negotiating these relationships, a few people's lives were reduced to utter misery from which, frankly, their lives never recovered. Now, that's why you have to intervene, but the right way to intervene is to try to make sure that you teach people this wider skill of wider relationships than just your friends or your gang. And I think we have failed to do that, which is why you get the policing. And you're right, people are told you aren't very good at it, so have the policing. But I think you can actually tell people, you are good at it, let us help you be good at it. And I think that's where our society is not so good at helping people not to be individuals, but how to actually create wider communities. And it's a skill that needs teaching.
Martin's friend at the back, for me, you're right and you're wrong. For me, the banter question, I don't think banter is the most important aspect of friendship. But for me, it's a slightly aside question. It's a question about language and our relationship with ourselves and with our fellow human beings, relationship with each other. And I really detest the way that language is being policed, and we're policing ourselves with language. And banter is a really interesting aspect of that. I think the thing about language is this. Language is a human-made thing. We make language, right? It's not as though it's come down from the sky. No offence, Father. It hasn't been come down from the skies. We made it, okay? If we cut ourselves off and say, you do that trick, we say, I can't say it to that person because it's this, it's that, or the other, we're cutting ourselves off from ourselves. I think the place that should be the unsafest space and the safest space is our own minds, our own ways of working out the world. And then part of friendship is you try out language with friends. I see this with my nephews, who are now more than one of them is more than a teenager, but I've got a nephew who's autistic and 14. He's trying out a little bit of risque language and jokes because he's trying to negotiate his way in the world and what the relationship would be. Language is important for that. So that's my point on that. But the issue where you're saying it's bigger than just banter, I do agree with. And the point I want to make, particularly to the kind of women and gossip and men have it a bit hard point is, the point about gossip, charmingly put about women talking amongst each other or men talking about each other, is it's private. Some conversations and relationships are private. Friendship is a private thing between people, and we should remember that. The problem with the workplace is it's negotiating a sort of public-private interface sometimes. How do we deal with that? I just want to also say, women are not separate species. Say, can I come down the pub with you? Ask them, but then you're probably too scared to do that. We're not different. We're the same bleeding people.
Maybe some people in the audience have things to say about the workplace specifically, or indeed anything else, so who'd like to make a point?
I think the assumption here is that women are somehow subjected to men's banter, and I think that's what you were saying, that we're not a different species. You know, we're people, we're funny. Like, women are funny, and women, you know, the world is so deprived of female comedians at the moment, and female authors and female playwrights, because the world is still adjusting to that change. And as a young woman, I know that the workplace is not a sort of, it's not systematically oppressive for men, and I think that's what we're missing. And I think that banter in the workplace, it could be very different from a lower job to a massively high up job. The mindset's different, and I know that I've been subjected to some banter, but that wasn't male to female, that was person to person, some banter which I thought was inappropriate. And that wasn't because it happened to be a man, it was because that person was deprived, I think, possibly systematically from a school age, of that experience to, as you said, sort of find their own friendship groups and to externally manipulate children's friendship groups at a young age is depriving them of that chance to grow up and realise that, you know, life isn't fair, you're going to get some people who are being horrible to you. And I think from that stage onwards, you learn how to filter your language, how to filter your banter, and how to become an adult. And being an adult, part of that is learning to realise what is acceptable in a workplace and what's not acceptable.
Thank you very much. And we had a point, more points.
I think it was Slavoj Žižek who said that love is being able to say, I hate you. And I kind of think that's similarly the case with kind of friendship. I have some sympathy with the idea about kind of the banality of banter, but I also have some sympathy with the idea, well, that's the kind of point about it. And the irony is that kind of banter has itself become institutionalized, and it's itself a reflection of that policing. but it becomes a kind of almost an infantile response to that's how we're expected to kind of communicate and behave. I think the issue with friendship, or the issue I have with friendship, is that the intimacy is being sucked out of it. That ability to actually tell my best friends to fuck off and do it as I mean it, and them to be able to take it as I mean it. That, to me, is what friendship is about. It's about not being nice to people, which I think is what we sometimes talk about. It's actually being horrible, nasty, and a pain in the butt to people.
Okay, thank you.
I'll be honest.
Yes, oh, you got it, thank you. Right.
I really do love banter. The idea of being able to say something about my friend's favorite football team and then him saying something right back at me, or being able to say something about my friend and her schoolwork, and she's able to say something right back at me, and it's mildly offensive, and then being able to laugh about it afterwards. I think that's beautiful. Yeah. What makes banter uncomfortable, and this has been touched upon, is the idea of a stranger sort of trying to do the same thing with you. That's when it becomes offensive, and I understand that. However, then we have to have the discussion, what makes a stranger? Because I know people who I've been in class with for more than 7 years now. I'm in year 13, and I've known them since primary school. But I would still class them as a stranger. If they said something mildly offensive to me, I would take that as an attack on me and my character. So what is a stranger? I also wanted to ask, what is the role of religion when it comes to fellowship and friendship? And I want to give an example. I'm a practicing Muslim, and in my mosque, I have prayed next to people, and I've made friends with. I come from a Pakistani background, and I've made friends with Indians, Libyans, Algerians, white Irishmen. My only Northern English friend happens to be a Muslim as well, and I met him by praying next to him and then having a conversation afterwards. Now, I understand how one of the speakers said earlier about how this can create sort of gangs, like the whole idea of policing a playground to make sure there's no exclusion. I endorse that point. It's a good point. But then how can you police the playground to the playground to make sure that inclusion does happen without offending people's faiths or backgrounds? How can you get these gangs or so-called gangs to no longer be gangs and become friendships and invite other people? Because of course some people might see that as offensive. I don't, but others may. So those are quite a few questions that I hope the panel considers.
So I went to a secondary school that was out in Essex, and I was one of very few people of colour. And when I started in year 7, I had no friends. No one wanted to talk to me. People engaged in banter about the colour of my skin, my class, where I grew up, and what my hair did or didn't do. It wasn't until my mum actually went to the school and pointed out that I was having a really horrible time that the teachers actually noticed this as being a problem. So I'm interested to hear more about, I guess, the idea of negotiating friendships and kids being encouraged to negotiate friendships, and the playground being an extension of real life, and how much responsibility it is that we're leaving on the shoulders of students who may be from minority groups.
Thank you very much for that point. I'm sure our panelists might want to speak to that. Okay, so on last 4 points, any particular things you want to, Christopher?
I mean, just taking up the point there about religion and friendship in all this. And it relates to that last point too about the racism in that primary school in Essex. At its best, all religious communities believe in that wider relationships being something that's taught. You know, love your neighbour is a pretty fundamental precept of all the world's religions. And therefore, it's recognised that it has to be taught. I just want to keep coming back to this point. We seem to think that we need to teach friendship. Well, yes, but I think friendship happens quite spontaneously. I think what doesn't happen spontaneously is precisely loving your neighbour who is different. And you described all those different nationalities and so on. And religion has the capacity to bring people together like that. At the moment, it's always assumed that religion breeds violence and division. But actually, the sort of story you're talking about there reminds us that at a simple grassroots level, religion is about fostering those wider relationships beyond friendship groups, which are, if you like, the guarantee, it seems to me, of unpoliced friendships. If you have a wider community that works well, then people can have the friendships they want to have and say rude things to each other within them and stay friends. But I think that our biggest challenge is what other, apart from religious groups, what other groups are there out there trying to create these wider relationships beyond nationality and so on, beyond those groups? And the answer is they're shrinking. They tend to be trade unions and other institutions like that have diminished dramatically, as have churches and religious groups. So where in this vacuum are we going to be teaching people how to have those wider relationships, which then, in a sense, are the container within which friendship can flourish?
Okay, thank you, Martin.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about the matter of faith, though. It's an excellent point. In fact, in the University College London report we've just finished, we looked at faith and the importance of faith, and we found some really amazing results. Perhaps totally unsurprising to you guys, but in an age where it's almost unfashionable to sort of celebrate the role of faith in positivity, we saw that the men who were attending, and across faith sort of sample size, the men who were attending sort of religious gatherings were benefiting from, they were having a significant uplift in their positive mental index. So I think there's certainly a role. One of the things we're going to talk about when we're having a parliamentary launch for this report on November the 16th, ahead of International Men's Day on the 19th of November. Faith, I think, has perhaps a new and important role to play in sort of reaching out to men and encouraging them, because they are certainly having an uplift by practicing. So that's a great point. The second thing to the lady there, what you were suffering wasn't banter, it was racism. And I think that's the thing. There's a big difference. And my point is, the kids who were saying that might have thought it was banter, but they'd gone too far, right? But what do we do at that point? Do we have these kind of hammer to smash the hazelnut sort of situations we've seen in Derbyshire where kids are getting arrested? It's ludicrous. They're kids. They're making mistakes. They're taking wrong turns. Maybe they've learnt bad habits at home. We don't know their family backgrounds. Let's educate those children. Make them understand what they're doing is inappropriate. But that's not banter. That's toxic racism. I think it's a separate thing.
Okay, Shirley.
It's so interesting. I was really sparked by the question about strangers. I think that's a really interesting, the kindness of strangers, which is an ironic line from Tennessee Williams. But I'm really interested, and sometimes I've benefited from the kindness of strangers, I've got to say. The word I'm looking for is trust. The thing about friendships and our relationships is about trust, and it's about who you let in to your banter and who you close the door to sometimes in a situation where kids are being consciously or unconsciously racist. I've got to say, I agree with Martin. I think we've got to be very careful, because there is a mood now when kids are taking wrong turns, saying perhaps stupid, unfortunate things, where they're labelled as just out-and-out racist when they're just kids. They're kids. So I think we've got to be very careful about this. But and it comes back to the wider society, how do we go out from the comfort of our communities to that wider human being-filled world and let people in or out? What is it that lets us open the door to the intimacy where we can tell people to F off or not, have the banter or not? And I've got to say, I think we've got to, again, it comes back to that risk of friendship and relationship. Sometimes we've got to move out of our comfort zone, our safe space of my faith or your faith. I guess I would call myself a humanist. I have got to say, sometimes your faith will be offended. People will not agree with you. They're going to say things that you don't agree with. And I don't think you close the door then. If they're out and out being obnoxious and everything, maybe you close the door. But it's tolerance. It's trust and tolerance to a difference of opinion. And I think that's really important. But it's a great question.
And of course, we tolerate things we don't approve of, not things we do approve of, and that's often forgotten. We've got 1 minute left, or maybe 2 at most. I'm still quite interested in this question of how we should behave towards the friendships of utility, people in the workplace. I mean, for example, if you might make some joke about a fat person using the word fat, and you just notice when it's too late that somebody in the room is fat. So you wonder, should I have said that? Should I have been aware of this? And then this sort of thing. Anything about that, or indeed anything else, just very briefly, Christopher?
My final thought, which is not to do with that, was I'm always intrigued by this Humanist Sunday assembly, where people turn up to sing hymns, because if you sing hymns, you'll live longer. you know, never mind eternal life. You'll have life here, apparently, medically proven that hymn singing improves your heart, lung, and longer life. And then you'll meet strangers, and you'll have fellowship, and you'll listen to interesting readings and hear an interesting talk. You just don't have to believe in God. It's this fascinating. The Humanist Sunday Assembly absolutely fascinates me because it seems to be an attempt to fill that vacuum of how do we make these connections beyond the friendship groups and do things communally as a community as opposed to a friendship group. And I'm fascinated by that. And I think it shows there is a human need for this, which religion used to fulfill and other institutions. And if it goes, we have to admit it's a human need. How are we going to fulfill it?
They'd admit that.
Yeah.
Martin.
Yeah, I think in the workplace now we're entering a new era where we are sort of dreadfully, not dreadfully, I don't know, we're self-policing to such an extent that it's just becoming bloody boring in a lot of places. Everyone's just like, oh, okay, it's so perfunctory. And we do live in an era where a single tweet or a single misplaced comment can just end careers, like Nobel laureates. Their careers are over. Wearing the wrong shirt as a NASA scientist, your career is over. You know, in one moment, because of one gaffe, it's like, for Christ's sakes. This, I actually think, makes people more abusive. Under the shield of anonymity on social media where nobody can be identified, people get sort of Tourette's. People just go mad because they're not allowed to. Prohibition has never worked, ever. In any human trait, we can't stop booze, we can't stop pornography, we can't stop drugs, we will never stop toxic banter. Surely, a better thing to do is just to sort of say to people, look, this can hurt. Why are you doing that? Rather than, you've lost your job. Because that person's not going to become suddenly understanding and suddenly liberal. They're going to be angrier. And I think this smashing down upon it, you know, is actually more divisive and doesn't solve the problem.
Friendships in my life have been a bedrock that have kept me going. And I've made friends at work, and I've taken different people with me from different places I've worked, and I have faith and trust. And they've got me through some bad times with kind words and firm words, harsh words sometimes. But the thing I would say is, it's bigger than that, and it's bigger than just our friends. You know, what we do in the world, where we are in the world, how we shape the world, is bigger than that intimate moment of friendship. It's about seeing that bigger picture about how we relate to each other. I hate the humanist Sundays because it's trying to replicate something where actually I think you can't. I think that's come from a particular faith, and I have respect for that, but it's a different thing. For me, that humanist shaping and also faith shaping of the world is bigger than that. I think it's bigger than the horrible moment you may have experienced with racism at school. We've got to look outside of those moments and say, how do we as society shape the world, starting from those relationships where we have trust and faith in each other?
To our three panellists, Father Christopher Jamison, Martin Daubney, Shirley Dent, thank you very much, and thank you to you.